Now, another part of Grant's success was he really got along with the Navy. There's often competition between the services. Often the competition is about budgets. But Grant is this very, very low key, super competent individual that had a knack for pretty much getting along with everybody that he worked with. And so he worked very closely with this guy, Flag Officer Andrew Foote, who had the naval steamers that were on as part of this campaign. And together, the Army and the Navy, under Grant, overall command, Army, Flag Officer Foote, the Navy, in February of 1862, they captured Fort Henry. By the way, Fort Henry, although it was very, very strategically important on the Tennessee River, was very, very poorly built. And it flooded, and it wasn't very, very hard to capture, long story short. And so Fort Henry fell into Grant's hands pretty easily. Then, Grant being Grant, like if McClellan had captured Fort Henry, he would have sat on his ass and, sent out all these telegrams, celebrating himself. But Grant was made of different stuff. And after he captured Fort Henry, he moved on Fort Donelson within like the next day or so. This is very, very characteristic of Grant. And again, he's the anti-McClellan. He doesn't mess around. So he captures Fort Henry, takes a quick breather, and then moves on to Fort Donelson. And Donelson was tougher than Fort Henry. First of all, there was really bad weather. There was a cold front that blew in, and Union soldiers at this point were very, very inexperienced soldiers. Most of them had just been soldiers. They'd come from civilian life. They had volunteered. They weren't professional army men. And as they marched from Fort Henry to Fort Donelson, they thought Fort Donelson would be an easy capture as well. It's hot, so they started, throwing away their jackets and, a lot of the things that would have kept them warm. And then a front came in and it froze almost overnight, and, hundreds of Union soldiers, or at least dozens anyway, froze to death. It was that cold. The other thing is that Fort Donelson was just a tougher position to capture than Fort Henry was. And what you have is a bit of a siege situation where Fort Henry just very, very quickly fell into Grant's hands and to the hands of Admiral Foote. Fort Donelson was a lot tougher. The Confederates actually made an attempt to break from Fort Donelson, and they did find a gap in the Union lines, but they lost their nerve at the last second, and then they went back into Fort Donelson. So, long story short, it becomes clear to the Confederates that they can't beat Grant. Grant has surrounded them. It's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time. And so they decide to surrender. It's like, okay, we're not going to win this thing. Grant can starve us out. We can't escape. Grant's tightening his lines. And what happened is that they decided to surrender. But none of the Confederates wanted to surrender to Grant because they thought it would be kind of suicide to their reputations. So the commander of Fort Donelson, guys by the name of Floyd and Pillow, they're passing around command like a hot potato. And finally, this guy named Simon Bolivar Buckner was appointed commander of Fort Donelson. And what's interesting is Buckner and Grant had a history together. And it was actually a pretty positive history. They were close friends. When Grant came back from the West Coast after he had resigned from the Union Army, more or less in disgrace, he runs into Buckner, and Buckner actually lends him money. This is like 1854. Buckner takes pity on him and lends him money so Grant can get to St. Louis where his wife is. Again, it's a very, very small world. So Buckner, he's appointed commander of Fort Donelson because the other two more senior officers don't want the humiliation. And Buckner thinks that Grant's going to, remember this favor that he did him, and he asks, Grant, what are his conditions? I'm willing to surrender to your army, but what conditions, will you give us a break? That kind of a thing. And Grant answered, no terms except for an unconditional and an immediate surrender can be accepted. So this is how this electrified the Northern public. Think about what's going on in Virginia at this time. It's February of '62. McClellan is still screwing around in the East. He hasn't even begun the Peninsular Campaign. Nothing's going on except for training in the Eastern Theater. Now, suddenly, like a bolt out of the blue, this unknown Union general, U.S. Grant, captures these two hugely important, if I can sound like Donald Trump, I always say huge, but I guess I have to gravitate away from it now. Anyway, these two very significant positions on the Tennessee River, Fort Henry, and on the Cumberland River. And what this basically means is that Tennessee is fallen into the hands of the Union. It's been recaptured by the United States. And the other thing is the Northern public really liked Grant's, unconditional surrender. What they're getting in the East is McClellan kind of hem-hawing around and being insubordinate to Lincoln. What they get in Grant is, first of all, a victorious general, a guy that's very aggressive, a guy that doesn't, low-key, doesn't just sit on his laurels. That's good enough. But he says unconditional surrender. So Grant's victories really electrify the Northern public, and he becomes a national figure almost overnight. So what you have is that unconditional Grant becomes a new hero of the North. The South is forced out of. There had still been some Southern troops in the southern part of Kentucky, but they're forced to retreat. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers fall into Union hands. Nashville is captured by the Union Army, and it becomes a huge supply depot for the Union Army in the West. And the heartland of the Confederacy falls into Union hands. So Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, or let me put it in the proper order, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, although in a lot of ways they're not as, maybe if you don't mind me using this language, they're not as sexy as Gettysburg or Antietam, things like that. They are hugely important victories for the Union Army at a point where the Union Army really needed victories. And one of the ways you might want to think about these victories is they're body punches to the Confederacy in the Western Theater. They're really hard punches to the ribs of the Confederacy. And the Confederacy loses Southern Kentucky, they lose Nashville, they lose Tennessee. And so this is a major victory in February of 1862 at a time when the North was desperate for victories. And this launches Grant on what will become his storied career as a Union officer, as a commanding officer in the Union Army. But Grant's still going to have some ups and downs. He doesn't get to the East. He's not plugged into the Eastern Theater for over 2 years after the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So he still has a ways to go before he comes east and he leads the Union Army to victory beginning in the spring of 1864 and moving into the spring of 1865.